No son zesfenu medenolo sulupu prosoligon estitozen totelos
In
ochronos
this video, we'll be exploring the second part of our review of public intellectualism in Athens of the 5th century. Last time we talked about the social, economic background of Athens in this time and the birth of tragedy and comedy in particular. And we got a little bit ahead of ourselves in thinking about how philosophers tried to answer the tragic question, is it always possible to be good? Or what is the nature of human goodness and is it fragile? This time with the Sophists, we're going to be talking about figures like Protagoras and Gorgias, as well as Aspasia and Socrates. Again, we'll be talking about how later philosophers sought to define the Sophists as a movement against the background of which philosophy itself could be identified and distinguished as something very different. So hopefully we can bear that in mind as we think about the evidence that we have for many of these figures and their influence. This also brings us to a big question similar to the one about the framing of philosophy against the background of tragedy. Two questions come up in particular when philosophers contrast themselves later with the people they consider sophists, excluding some of the people on our list. Socrates, for example, is seen as very much a philosopher. One of these questions is there more to truth than persuasion? On the philosopher's view, the sophists say no, there isn't, and the philosophers say yes, there is. We have to keep asking questions and seeking for the truth. It's not just a matter of persuading people through rhetoric, through oratory, or through any means we can. Secondly, the question whether there's more to justice than powerful self-interest. Here too we'll find that many of the philosophers frame their answer, particularly in the tradition of Socrates, which also includes in some ways Aspasia as a teacher. For them, Socrates will answer, yes, of course there is. Justice is, in a way, a road to happiness that is very distinct from mere self-interest, from seeking one's own pleasure or ease. And again, for the philosophers, the sophists answer in the negative. For them, what it is to seek justice is really, in a way, just to look out for oneself. And that's a view that philosophers in the Socratic tradition will also strongly seek to oppose. So without further ado, let's think a bit more about the Sophists in 5th century Athens and how they developed their ideas. We're going to start out with an introduction as best as we can to their position in Athens. First, their name. Sophistes is from the word Sophia, which means wisdom or expertise. You might recognize this word from the word philosopher, which means a lover of wisdom, somebody who's seeking wisdom. But sophist is to Sophia like chemist is to chemical or chemistry. A chemist is one who works with chemicals, a sophist is one who works with wisdom. They are wisdomers, not only seekers of wisdom, and that's a distinction we'll notice is important later. The sophists, under this name, which was again often given to them by others, were active and very publicly visible intellectuals in Athens, usually visitors to the city, not citizens, who claimed expertise in a wide range of topics and offered to teach what they knew. In fact, they came to Athens partly to make a living in this wealthy city by teaching as citizens, levying large fees for wealthy young people who could afford to pay those fees. What did they want to teach? Protagoras of Athens, who is one of the eldest and the most visible of the sophists, advertised himself in Plato's dialogue by the same name, Protagoras, like this. He can teach how to manage your affairs, economics of the household, how to manage public affairs, what advice to give to the assembly, how to make the most effective contribution to the affairs of the city by word and action, and how to make people good citizens. A lot of this has to do with Athens' unique system of government for its time. In Athens, a large democratic assembly of all of the male citizens over 20, still disenfranchising women and slaves and metics, but without reference to wealth or family background, this assembly would make decisions on major matters of policy effectively by referendum. So if a speaker could come along and persuade as many people as possible in that group to take an action, maybe even to go to war with another city-state, In 15 minutes of charismatic and energetic speaking, they could steer the ship of state. And that was pretty powerful. So, what the Sophists could offer, perceived maybe a bit more cynically than how Protagoras puts it here, is the power of persuasion to get what you want from a large group by moving them through words. And Athens was clearly the place to do it, both wealthy enough to support a class of teachers with that goal, and powerful and organized in such a way that it made a difference to teach young people how to do that kind of thing in the assembly. So uh, that's a bit of a cynical take or a bit of a hostile take on the Sophists. It is a pretty common one in antiquity from their contemporaries and successors, but it's important to stress that those are mostly hostile reports, and the individuals who fall under this label of sophist may have been quite a bit more diverse. There's just a lot of different innovative thinkers who are called sophists in the 5th and 4th centuries. Anaxagoras, for example, the pre Socratic philosopher, Aspasia, the orator, teacher of rhetoric, Socrates, later the icon of philosophy with students like Plato and Xenophon, all of them were at one point or another called sophists or public intellectuals in some broad sense. There was a political animus directed against many of the sophists, that is, in this sense, a kind of hostility against Anaxagoras and Aspasia, maybe in part because of their association with Pericles, who you might remember from our previous conversation was a particularly influential democratic statesman in general. Also against Socrates, not necessarily only because of what he said or did, but because he had been associated with figures like Alcibiades and some of the 30 tyrants, who were very much persona non grata in later Athenian democracy in the early 4th century when he was brought to trial in 399, even though, according to his supporters, he tried his best to reform these people, but they left him too early. So people could, in a way, be treated as sophists or as negative influences merely by association. In addition, though, there were some apparent philosophical reasons, or we could call them that, for grouping people together under this title with a bit of a hostile attitude. One was their perceived focus on relativism, or the idea that everything is just as it seems to each individual perspective. Protagoras is maybe most famous for this view. As he puts it, the human being is the measure of everything, of what is that it is, of what isn't that it isn't. So things just are as they seem to each person. If you think the wind is cold and I think it's warm, then you're right for you and I'm right for me. That seems pretty reasonable. Uh, when it's extended a little further, it starts to seem like a kind of moral relativism, and that's where people get a little bit more worried. So, what if justice is like that? What seems just to you is just what's just. What seems just to me is just what's just. And there are no other facts of the matter that we can appeal to resolve a disagreement about what's just. So, what do we do? Well, this is where the persuasion part comes in. The sophists were often attacked for making the weaker argument stronger, or in other words, making something look true that was actually false, fake news. So, this kind of capacity to make people believe what's not true by making it look real seemed really dangerous, especially again if you consider that this was a city state with a lot of power, economic and military, acting based on decisions made by a large assembly, often moved quite spontaneously by a powerful speaker. So, if you think there's no fact of the matter about things beyond persuasion, and you're teaching people how to get what they want by making one thing look like another, leading to war or major policy changes, that's a pretty easy way to see how the sophist in general could be put together as a dangerous force by some, at least, in Athens. Another angle in this is that at least more traditional Athenians, that is, those who followed, in their own view, some of the traditional values, we could say in inverted commas, of the poets like Homer and Hesiod, saw in the Sophists an opponent to those traditional values. That includes their attitude to the gods. Protagoras was famously agnostic about the gods. He said in Fragment 4, concerning the gods, I'm unable to know either that they are, or that they are not, or what their appearance is like. He's not saying there are no gods, but he's saying he's not sure that a human being can know about them. And he goes on to explain why he thinks that's so difficult to do. Because there is that sort of questionable or skeptical attitude toward poetic tradition, coupled with this sort of tendency to seem to persuade and teach for persuasion of whatever anybody thought might be true, uh, the Sophists' further interest as public intellectuals in the study of nature, in the theme of many of the pre-Socratics that we've looked at, also seemed quite questionable to many Athenians. So Anaxagoras, for instance, the associate of Pericles and one of the pre-Socratic nature philosophers or natural philosophers, was actually exiled from Athens on charges of impiety for claiming that the sun was a burning rock. You might notice there's some fragments about Anaxagoras that are similar. For example, when he stresses that he thinks the moon reflects the light of the sun. So the study of nature in this way, coupled with agnosticism about the gods, coupled with this sort of relativism about values, seem to all hang together. And thinkers who espoused any view that kind of looked like one of these could be thought of as holding them all in a way and potentially being a destructive influence in the perception of contemporary Athenians. In fact, Socrates himself, again, sometimes called a sophist later, although his successors were at great pains to argue that he was the opposite, stresses that he came to trial for impiety and corrupting the young. Those were the formal charges in 399, because people thought he was a sophist. So, in one of the passages from Plato's Apology or Defense Speech of Socrates, around 19b to c, Socrates says, a lot of people have been coming and accusing me to you for a long time, over years, and they weren't saying anything true. But I'm actually more worried about them than I am about the formal prosecutors, even though those are dangerous enough. These other people are more dangerous because they got a hold of most of you when you were children, and they started making their case to you then, making accusations against me that didn't have any more truth to them. Things like this. There's this Socrates, a wise man, Sophos, who thinks hard about what's in the sky and what's under the earth. He really studies that intensely, and he makes the worst arguments seem more convincing or the worst arguments seem stronger. So this is almost code for sophist. He is professing to be able to make sense of what's in the sky and under the earth. That is, he's a natural philosopher. And secondly, he seems to be able to make worse arguments seem true. So he's an artisan of persuasion. These are my dangerous accusers, my fellow Athenians. These are the ones who've been splattering this story all over the place, because people who hear this think that anyone who studies things like that doesn't even respect the gods. So you can see in a way it's as if Anaxagoras or Protagoras were brought to trial from Socrates' point of view. He doesn't think that he himself is very much like the Sophists, but because he asks a lot of questions and challenges traditional views, he's tarred with the same brush. And that's an important example of the kind of negativity that could apply to them in Athenian antiquity. So let's talk a bit about the individual sophists, who some of these characters were. We can start with Protagoras of Abdera, somewhat appropriately. His name literally means the first in speech. He probably lived from around about 490 to 420 BC, and we've mentioned already some of the most important fragments associated with him, like the idea that a person is the measure of everything, that it is, that it is, that it's not, that it's not. That is, for example, there's no fact of the matter about whether the wind is cold apart from how it feels to you and how it feels to me. What else does that apply to? Well, agnosticism about the gods, as we've seen, but also ethical questions. What's really just or fair could be a matter of perspective. And of course, it seems natural to suppose there must be some truth to that. The question is whether it's completely reducible to perspective, and there's really nothing else we can do but just persuade and hope for the best. Then again, there's also a kind of trust of sensation or sensory knowledge in Protagoras that comes with a distrust of other forms of knowing, like mathematics. So he questions whether there are real mathematical objects or geometrical objects apart from the sensory representations of them. And that will be important later, as we'll see, for it's the kind of view that Plato, for instance, stands on the other side of. Another important sophist of the period, maybe a little younger than Protagoras, is Gorgias of Leontini. His name might mean something like the grim. It could also, by the way, maybe be etymologically related to the English word gorgeous through an interesting route via French. According to Gorgias, logos, that is speech, argument, has an amazing power. It's like magic, it's like a new technology. And he gave wonderful kind of pyrotechnic displays of rhetorical virtuosity in Athens in the 5th century, displaying the power of speech to persuade and celebrating it, as well as maybe helping people to recognize that its power could be dangerous. And this comes back to the theme that the Sophists are perceived as almost magicians, as illusionists, as jugglers, for their power to use speech for persuasion. Anaxagoras is another person who is often considered a sophist. You might recognize he has one of these wonderful Milesian style Anax names, like Anaximander and Anaximenes. Anax means the lord or the king, in this case, Agoras, just like the Agoras in Protagoras' name, has to do with speech. Or the Agora, the marketplace, again, that's the place where a lot of speech goes on. Anaxagoras was a major natural philosopher. He investigated the natural world, but what he found there was mind, or nous, consciousness, intentionality. That's going to be important to Plato later on as well. His theory of the elements was a little bit different from, say, Empedocles's. You might remember from when we talked about Empedocles that for him, the basic roots of things are earth, water, air, and, that's right, fire. Anaxagoras takes a different view. For him, the basic elements of things are not elements exactly at all. They're homoiomeres. What's that? Well, homoios means the same or similar, and meros is a part. These are things that have all the parts the same, or appear to. So, for example, he was interested in kind of proto-experiments of breaking things apart until you got to the stage where everything looked the same. All the parts were homoiomerous and indistinguishable from each other. So at a certain point, water can become like that. But some of the apparent elements don't seem like that. This led him to posit many more roots that were homoiomerous, not only the traditional four elements. And he also argued that there were maybe an infinity of basic seeds, all of them in character, potentially possessing all the rest at the basis of the world around us. He again was the person who was called a sophist and exiled from Athens on charges of impiety, ostensibly for his remarks about the sun. But you can see how someone like this could also be tarred with the same sort of brush, so to speak, or criticized along the same lines as a Protagoras or a Gorgias, who were apparently more interested in the persuasive power of speech. Another very important figure in the oratorical and philosophical developments of the 5th century is Aspasia, whose name Aspasia means literally something like a glad welcome. Uh, she probably was roughly the same age as Gorgias, maybe a little bit younger, and she came from Miletus, which we've talked about quite a bit with the Milesian philosophers, again, like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. Uh, she was a political consultant of Pericles, it seems like. She was frequently portrayed in ancient sources as a hetaira, sometimes translated as a courtesan, partly because she was a free and unmarried partner of Pericles. Not being an Athenian woman, she wasn't able to marry Pericles and he wasn't able to marry her, though the sources say they were very much in love. But perhaps particularly because of Pericles' political positions, she was targeted along with him for all these kinds of criticism and sexualized in her own time in a way that made it more difficult for her to be taken seriously as a philosopher and as a political figure. That seems very unfair given the perspective of many of the ancient sources. We hear, for example, that she may have been the author of Pericles' celebrated funeral oration of Athens, recorded in Book 2 of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, may be one of the great political speeches ever. In addition, she's referenced often as a teacher of rhetoric. For example, Plato, if he is the author of the dialogue called Menexenus, references Aspasia as Socrates' educator in oratory and speech. Athenaeus makes a similar point quite a bit later, maybe preserving early sources. And Xenophon, Socrates' pupil, remarks that Socrates portrayed her as a teacher or a superior in her understanding of economics. She also left traces of acts, views, ethical approaches to counseling individuals and couples, and thoughts about logic. She was defended by Pericles against charges of impiety. you might be getting used to this now with Anaxagoras and Socrates as well. These often were charges that were a way to try to get rid of public intellectuals. She survived Pericles, though, and her later life in the 5th century is a mystery based on the sources that we have. Here's a passage about her from Lucian of Samosata, quite a bit later, but again preserving earlier sources, in this case with a bit of a satirical tone, but reflecting something of the way that many sources saw Aspasia. We must delineate her wisdom, Sophia, says his character, and understanding, Sunesis. Will require a lot of models, paradigmata there, most of them ancient, and one, like herself, Ionic. That is from Ionia. You might remember this region in modern Turkey, then Anatolia. Painted and wrought by Aeschines, the friend of Socrates. This was another of Socrates' disciples, along with Xenophon and Plato, though we only have Aeschines' dialogues of Socrates in fragments. And by Socrates himself, of all craftsmen the truest copyist, because they painted with love. It is that lady of Miletus, Aspasia, consort of the Olympian, Pericles, himself, a marvel beyond compare. Putting before us in her no mean pattern of understanding, let us take all that she had of experience in affairs, shrewdness in statecraft, quick-wittedness and penetration, and transfer the whole of it to our own picture by accurate measurement. So she's represented here in a way as a model of expertise, wisdom, and insight. This is a longer passage, but worth spending a bit of time with, even though we've elided a fair bit of it. This is a trace of a dialogue of Socrates by Aeschines. Again, we only have Aeschines' dialogues of Socrates in fragments, unlike Plato and Xenophon, which we have pretty much in full. But in this dialogue, Socrates tells the story of how Aspasia reasoned with the wife of Xenophon and with Xenophon himself about their relationship. We actually have this passage because it's offered as an example of inductive logic or argument in later sources like Cicero in his De Inventione. And you can see a little bit of how inductive logic works here, that is, giving one example after another and leading the interlocutor to accept a universal principle on the grounds of each of the inductive steps. This is a pretty familiar kind of reasoning in mathematics as well. So here's what Aspasia says. She's speaking first to the wife of Xenophon. Again, he's a student of Socrates. Please tell me, madam, if your neighbor had a better gold ornament than you have, would you prefer that one or your own? That one, she replied. And then Aspasia gives a number of other examples like this. Well, now, she finally says, if she had a better husband than you have, would you prefer your husband or hers? At this, the woman blushed. But Aspasia then began to speak to Xenophon. I wish you'd tell me, Xenophon, she said, if your neighbor had a better horse than yours, would you prefer your horse or his? And it goes on a similar sort of track. Now, if he had a better wife than you have, would you prefer yours or his? And at this, Xenophon too himself was silent. Then Aspasia said, since both of you have failed to tell me the only thing I wish to hear, I myself will tell you what you're both thinking. That is, you, madam, wish to have the best husband, and you, Xenophon, desire above all things to have the finest wife. Therefore, unless you can contrive that there be no better man or finer woman on earth, you will certainly always be in dire want of what you consider best, namely, that you be the husband of the very best of wives, and that she be wedded to the very best of men. And this seems to be offered in part as an argument for each person to be their best, and being their best or flourishing or being fully human at their best would be a way to make the relationship as good as possible as well. And this is partly in response to the questions that they purportedly came to her with. So there's an interesting bit of logic there for somebody who is represented as a teacher of oratory, and also an interesting bit of ethics. There's also a report that Aspasia emphasized truthfulness in describing one member of a couple to another. Of course, one more figure we can't leave out here in representing people who are at least called Sophists in the 5th century is Socrates of Athens. We haven't been able to avoid bringing Socrates up many times already. He is roughly in the same age period, a near contemporary of people like Gorgias and Aspasia, but he's often treated quite separately, as you can tell from names and labels we've used before, like pre-Socratic, before Socrates, or Sophist. Partly because Socrates is represented as a paradigmatic philosopher and so quite distinct from both. Socrates is often portrayed as a sophist, playfully at least, by contemporaries like the comedian Aristophanes in the play Clouds, which was produced around 423. And interestingly, Socrates, in Plato's dialogue, The Apology, his defense speech, sees that play as an important part of the problem of how he came to be looped in with sophistry for contemporary Athenians. Because of that, there was this major effort by his followers to try to peel Socrates apart as a character from the Sophists, at least in that pejorative sense that was gathering around them. As you can see from the hostility that figures like Anaxagoras and Aspasia had faced, both being brought to trial for one reason or another by the Athenians, and that Socrates himself faced in his own impiety trial in 399. Plato then repurposed this familiar word philosopher that might have had for most people a sort of sense like curious, in order to distinguish Socrates from the Sophists. So the Sophists were people who claimed to have wisdom, particularly wisdom, Sophia, about persuasion, nature, a variety of other things. Socrates, he said, wasn't like that. He didn't claim to have wisdom or Sophia. He sought it or loved it. He was a philosopher, not a sophist. So Socrates, according to the representation in Plato and Xenophon, claimed that he lacked wisdom and had nothing to teach. In particular, he denied that he studied anything like natural philosophy. He adopted a method only of questioning, not of answering. This is the famous Socratic method. He was impoverished and he charged no fees. He even said if he had any money, he'd pay people to talk to him. He wrote nothing down for publication. He endorsed the search for truth, and he had positive ethical views strongly distinct from the Sophists' own. In many of the following discussions after this video, we'll be looking at Socrates separately as a philosopher, but here in a way we're looking at him by way of preview in his engagement with the Sophists, including how his character was presented in opposition to what sophistry was all about. So let's turn now to how the Sophists appear in the kind of rear view mirror of the critical perspective of later Socratic philosophers. First, thinking of Socrates here again as a starting point, his student Plato, who writes a series of dialogues portraying him in conversation, is a really important source for this image of the Sophists. In making this effort, again, to just drive the point home, that Socrates was not a sophist, Plato adopts or appropriates a very widespread image of the sophistic movement that's negative. So everyone in a way could agree that these things are bad, but there might be disagreement about who falls under this general rubric. There's a couple of problems that Plato seems particularly concerned with in addressing himself to what's wrong with the Sophists as a big label. First, we could call it an epistemological problem, that is, a problem about knowledge, what they think about knowledge. In the ancient Greek sense, this could be called a logical problem, a problem about logos, about how human beings have and communicate what they know. The Sophists are concerned with influencing perception and opinion, as Plato stresses, and they take perception or perspective just to be the truth. And because of that, they're blinded from the search for the actual truth. In the allegory that will become very famous later, the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, Book 7, there's a problem that human beings face when they take shadows of reality to be reality. The Sophists are kind of like that. They're so sure that powerful persuasion of the kind that they can muster is basically what the truth amounts to, that there's no further facts of the matter about anything beyond persuasion, that they neglect to actually keep looking for the truth. They're also portrayed like jugglers and like greedy hunters because they're hunting young people who can pay for their services. In contrast, Socrates is presented as pursuing a process of honest and genuine question and answer that at least has the potential to lead to genuine truth. We find this contrast, for example, in Platonic dialogues like the Gorgias, where Socrates is represented questioning Callicles, who is portrayed as a kind of classic sophist in the negative sense. Besides that epistemological problem, there's also an ethical difficulty with the Sophists, again in this negative sense, as Plato portrays them. In particular, they seem to cultivate a kind of selfish morality that's grounded in power and the use of power to pursue only personal pleasure, which is ultimately destructive, as it's portrayed in Plato again in the first book of the Republic and the Gorgias. A way of summing this up is the view that might makes right. Socrates is also represented as disputing this. For him, justice, inside and outside, may lead to a happier, flourishing human life than the pursuit of self-interest alone. And that's a really important distinction for Plato as well. Again, it's important to stress that many of the characters who represent these negative or pejorative aspects of sophistry are not historical figures that we've just talked about. Um, Protagoras does appear in Plato's dialogues and does come in for criticism. So does Gorgias. But the ones who look really bad are figures like Thrasymachus and Callicles, who especially emphasize this kind of ethical problematic that Plato wants to emphasize and challenge. So it's in a way less a matter of criticizing any one of the individual historical sophists we've talked about, and more a matter of challenging these problems in the movement as a whole. And if it turns out that none of those people were sophists in quite this sense, that might not necessarily trouble Plato so much. He's concerned with the drama of representing a view, namely this view of um, radical relativism and self interest that he wants to challenge. And on his view, Socrates also wants to challenge. Here's a way of teasing out this sort of problematic or negative side of sophistry that Plato wants to challenge and dramatize Socrates in dialogue with. First, we could look at an earlier contrast, a very non sophistic view from Plato's point of view. This is the famous parable of the hawk and the nightingale in Hesiod in the Works and Days. At the beginning, it portrays a nightingale who's been captured by a hawk, transfixed by his crooked claws, and she laments when the imperious hawk addresses her, "Why, little lady, such shrieks? One stronger than you now has got you. Where you're going, I'll take you myself, though you are a songstress. For as I please, I'll make you my dinner, or give you your freedom. Witless is one who attempts to strive against those who are stronger. When he's stripped of the prize, it's injury added to insult." Thus said the fast-flying hawk, that bird with the generous wingspan. So that's a bit of the parable, the story. Now Hesiod's poetic voice comes in and comments on it. He's talking to his brother Perses, who he thinks is behaving a bit like the hawk, partly because he's stealing Hesiod's farm. And Hesiod says, "Pay more attention to justice. Curb high-handedness, my brother. Violence ill suits people who are lowly. Not even the noble man can lightly endure it. It weighs on a person who's fallen into affliction." Here's the key passage. "It's better to take your way on the other road, which conduces to right, because outrage or hubris, this kind of arrogant violence that the hawk represents, always surrenders to justice or decay. It's not actually in your interest to use your power in self-interest and take away the rights of others, trample on the dignity of others, as the hawk does. Might does not make right." So that's the contrast in Hesiod. And if we turn to some of the portrayals in the 5th and 4th century of the sophists in this negative sense, we can see how they reverse that view. One really famous one is in the Melian dialogue in Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. I'd stress that it's not the case that Thucydides, at least self-evidently, is endorsing this view, but he's portraying some of the Athenian generals who have tremendous military power, like sophists in this negative sense. They are confronting a much politically and militarily weaker power, the island of Melos, which has remained neutral in the war with Sparta. They have the option to spare Melos, and the Melians are trying to negotiate with the Athenian generals, but the Athenian generals hold all the cards of power, and their argument is that they can do what they like. So they put it like this: "You know as well as we do that when these matters are discussed by practical people, then the standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel, and that in fact the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must." Very famous bit of this passage that people have come back to again and again. Might makes right. Our opinion of the gods and our knowledge of human beings lead us to conclude that it's a general and necessary law of nature to rule whatever you can. This is not a law we made up, and we weren't the first to act on it when it was made. We found it already in existence and will leave it to exist forever among those who come after us. So here's this view that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, that's the way the world is. The challenge here isn't maybe so much the recognition descriptively that there is this kind of injustice in society, that often what's called justice turns out to be a matter of who's in power and what they want. It's the further thought that that's the best we can do, that's how it should be, and that kind of moral idea is going to guide the action of the Athenian generals. They destroy the city, and everyone goes with it. It's an atrocity that would be considered a war crime today. Another portrayal of the Sophists is in Plato's character Thrasymachus, who I mentioned before as an example of the worst of the Sophists in Plato. I contrasted him with well-known historical Sophists like Protagoras and Gorgias. I should stress here as well that Thrasymachus probably was an historical figure. His name is just too good. It means Mr. Bold Fighter, Thrasymachos, and he certainly is. So he's in the middle of arguing with Socrates in the first book of the Republic. Socrates has just suggested that people in government in a society should act like good shepherds who operate not in their own self-interest, but in the interest of the people who they purport to govern. And he replies, "Tell me, Socrates, do you still have a wet nurse? Because she's letting you run around with a snotty nose and doesn't wipe it when she needs to." Not a very friendly beginning. You think shepherds seek the good of their sheep and cattle, and fatten them and take care of them, looking to something other than their master's good and their own self-interest. You believe that rulers think of anything besides their own advantage. You're so far from understanding. You don't recognize that justice is actually the good of another party, namely, the advantage of the more powerful. And it's harmful to the one who obeys and serves. Injustice is the opposite. It rules the truly simple and just, and those it rules do what is to the advantage of the other and stronger, and they make the one they serve happy, but themselves not at all. This gets pretty circuitous and complicated, as we'll see when we look at Republic 1 more closely, but he sums it up quite clearly. Look at it like this. A just person always gets less than an unjust one. And this again is a description of a state of affairs. It's a descriptive statement about the way society seems to Thrasymachus to operate, but it also implies a kind of further normative or prescriptive idea about how it should be. One should be as unjust as you can, get as much as you can. There's no such thing as justice apart from power. Just like the Athenian generals in the Melian dialogue talking about the equality of power to compel. Might makes right. And one more example is Plato's Callicles. Callicles makes a similar point, but he frames it in terms of the distinction between how things are by nature, physis, and how they are by human custom or law. On his view, nature and law are for the most part opposed to each other. I believe, he says to Socrates, that the people who institute our laws are the weak and the many, so they institute laws and assign praise and blame with themselves and their own advantage in mind, as a way of frightening the more powerful out of getting a greater share than them. They say that getting more than one's share is shameful or unjust. But surely, if a man whose nature is equal to it arises, he will shake off, tear apart, and escape all of this. He will trample underfoot our documents, our tricks and charms, constitutions, laws, all these laws that violate nature. He, the slave, will rise up and be revealed as our master and hear the justice of nature, the law of the jungle. Might makes right, will shine forth. Same idea in a way, at least similar, but again justified a little differently in terms of this very famous opposition that some of the other sophists developed too between nature and law or custom. The idea that by nature it's the law of the jungle out there, power is the question, and it's only by human convention that there's anything else going on. And again, this further sense that not only is that a description of the way power operates in society, but it's also a prescription for how it should be. In this case, the idea that the powerful individual should really rise up and be unjust. Thrasymachus takes a view like this as well. Get as much as you can for yourself. So this is another aspect of the negative sophistry that Socrates will confront and is represented by Plato as a philosopher who opposes radically. On his view, what Callicles represents is what's most dangerous. It is the tyrant. Later, when we're looking at Republic Book 9, we'll get a similar sense of how Plato takes up this idea. The person who wants to seize power like this in the interest of their own appetites will not only destroy those around them, as at least a major risk, and trample their society, they will also destroy themselves. So, coming back to a summary, In the last video, we talked a bit about some of the other aspects of public intellectualism in 5th century Athens, especially tragedy and comedy, and how the soil of tragedy raised questions for philosophers about whether it's always possible to be good, and the harmony of inward motivations. Next, looking at the Sophists, we've explored the distinction in some ways between the individuals who were labeled Sophists and the negative construction of sophistry in the pages of authors like Plato, who really developed this notion as a foil for the identity of philosophy that they're going to develop. We've also stressed, I hope, that this means we should be thoughtful about each of these individuals. We shouldn't just take Socrates as a sophist. Plato really wants us to remember that, or Aspasia, or even Protagoras or Gorgias in this negative sense. But nonetheless, just like with tragedy, it's really important to recognize this constructed image as a real danger in Plato's eyes. For him, it's an urgent question to work out how there can be more to truth than just persuasion. He's seen the harm that persuasive speakers can do in the assembly in Athens. He's seen the way that democracy in the end tore itself apart, Callicles' prophecy being apparently true, under the influence of demagogues and tyrants, and eventually collapsed in the Peloponnesian War. He's also seen that there must be more to justice, he believes, than just the self interest of the powerful. And it's that wish, that search for true philosophy that leads him to study with Socrates and to compose the dialogues that we still have today, which we'll be looking at next.